I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of the Center for Latin American Studies. We're very pleased to be doing this webinar today with the title, The New Authoritarianism, the United States, Brazil, and the Americas. We are not at all pleased that the title is so appropriate at this critical moment for both countries, for much of the Americas. The basis of what we will do in the conversation today is look at Paul Pierson and Jacob Hacker's new book, Let Them Eat Tweets, How the Right Rules in an Age of Extreme Inequality. And of course, extreme inequality is something that is experienced every day within the United States, but also a critical issue for Brazil and really for all of the Americas, the most unequal region in the world. Paul Pierson in the book analyzes the slide towards authoritarianism in the United States and examines the future of the country with this in mind. He will discuss in the webinar today those ideas as a point of departure with Carlos Milani and Liz Mckenna, both in Brazil, who will also comment on the implication for Brazil and the Americas of what's taking place here. Our format is going to be very straightforward. Paul Pierson will lay out a brief overview of some of the central ideas in the book. Then we will have both Carlos Milani and then Liz Mckenna comment on these ideas, particularly putting them in a Brazilian context as well. We will have a brief conversation then among Paul, Liz, and Carlos and myself, and then we will open it to questions from those of you who are participating. Let me introduce very briefly Paul Pierson, who's the John Gross Professor of Political Science here at UC Berkeley. His teaching and research includes the fields of American politics and public policy, comparative political economy, and social theory. Beyond this, in my view, he is, as a political scientist and as a public intellectual, one of the most insightful observers of the political scene in the United States. Today, to be sure, but over a period of decades, he's brought creative ideas, values, perspective, and the tools of political science to give sense to what's unfolding. So Paul, why don't you begin?
Great. Wow, thank you so much, Harley, for those very kind words. And sorry, I'm going to try to get my slides up here to get going. Whoops, hold on just a second. I want to try to get that to the right slide. I'm just going to slip through it this way. It'll be faster. It's great to be with all of you today. And I was saying before we got started to the panelists that ever since I read Liz Mckenna's really wonderful dissertation that she's just completed on what's been going on in Brazil in the last few years, I was looking forward to this conversation because I've been talking about right-wing populism before a variety of audiences, and people often reach for comparisons to Europe. But one of the things that I want to suggest briefly, and then we can discuss more, is why Latin America, I think, is actually probably a much better place to look for comparisons for what's been going on in the United States. But let me get to that quickly, just move right into the talk, because I want to leave as much time as possible for a broader conversation. That I'm sure there are lots of people in the audience, in addition to the other panelists, who are going to have a lot to say about this topic. So people talk about the US as being a case of what's now called right-wing populism, but Jacob and I should thank Jacob as well, he's at least as responsible for the ideas I'm going to be talking about today as I am. Jacob and I wrote this book in large part because we thought using that term right-wing populism didn't really do justice to what has been going on in the United States, and particularly to the role of extreme inequality, as the subtitle of the book says, the role of extreme inequality in bringing us to the rather precarious juncture that we're at in American society. We think a better way to think about it is plutocratic populism, in which you do have these conventional right-wing populist elements represented in the US by forms of white nationalism, ethno-nationalism, mobilized in many ways by right-wing media and by groups like the Christian Right and the National Rifle Association. That's the populist element, but it's joined with an extreme plutocratic element, an element that really is pursuing the interests, not even of the top 1%, but the top 10th of 1% and the top 100th of 1%. And you could loosely, I think of plutocratic as involving many powerful corporations in the United States, not all of them, but we see, for example, the US Chamber of Commerce as an important organizing entity, also the Koch network in the US. So plutocrats involve a substantial part of corporate America, but also extremely wealthy, you call them right-wing billionaires, are an important part of that alliance as well. And what you see in the US is this combination of a populism built on outrage and resentment, combined with policies that are highly plutocratic, and which in combination have served to destabilize American politics, lead to various forms of minority rule, voter suppression, and of course the risk of even further democratic backsliding, as we're seeing in some of the events that are unfolding during this year's election cycle. So just to sketch it out a little bit more, a lot of people talk about the rise of Donald Trump as if he has somehow supplanted the conservative establishment within the Republican Party. But during his first year, you could hear Senate Leader Mitch McConnell, one of the leading allies of the plutocrats for a long time in American government, describing 2017 as the best year for conservatives in the 30 years that he'd been in the Senate, the best year on all fronts. And when Mitch McConnell is crowing, you know he's mostly not crowing about things like restricting abortion rights. He's concerned about things like putting on judges on the Supreme Court who are going to protect corporate interests and pursue a pro-corporate agenda. He's thinking about huge tax cuts. He's thinking about putting policymakers in charge of the Environmental Protection Agency who will gut efforts to deal with climate change and so on. And similarly, Charles Koch, the now remaining brother of the two leading Koch brothers who have led this hugely influential and richly resourced right-wing group that has been pursuing a plutocratic agenda. He says, we've accomplished more in the last 5 years than in the previous 50. Now, these people don't sound like they're ones who believe that they've lost out to wild populism within the Republican Party, and they're right to think that. The most dramatic example would be the Trump tax cuts. 83% of the permanent benefits in that $2 trillion tax bill went to the top 1% of the income distribution. Of course, the cornerstone of it was a cutting almost in half of the corporate tax rate, really just an astonishing and astonishingly regressive change in public policy. But as I've already suggested, there are a bunch of other ones too, whether you look at environmental regulation or changes in healthcare or the transformation of the Supreme Court. These are all things that the plutocrats are super excited about, even though they're things that are very unpopular with the American people, right? And this is an important point. I love this slide, but I won't spend too much time unpacking it because I want to keep moving, but it gives you a measure of polling results around the time of passage of major pieces of legislation in the US over the last 30 years. And what you see is at the beginning of the period, a lot of these bills are polling in the 70s or 80s. And then after that, they tend to poll in the 40s and 50s because the US is getting much more polarized. So it's hard to get consensus on any legislation. But the two big pieces of legislation, the healthcare bill and the tax cut bill that came in the first 14 months that Donald Trump was in office, those both polled in the low 20s, which is just shocking for any political scientist who thinks that you would expect politicians, when they get a chance in office, especially with this sort of big flagship pieces of legislation, to do things that would be at least reasonably popular. Extraordinarily unpopular pieces of legislation, two unicorns, as we put it, in a single year being produced. And what they have in common is that they're both bills that were designed to redistribute income radically up the income chain, from ordinary citizens to the top 1% or top 10th of 1%. So that's a puzzling thing in a democracy. And we argue that it reflects the dramatic shift in income distribution, and with it, the shift in the distribution of economic power and political power in the United States over the past 40 years or so that you can see represented here. This is an extraordinary change, and it's extraordinarily unusual, at least compared with the countries the US is usually compared with. So here's the story in Western Europe, right, where inequality has grown a little, but really just a little, right? So when people are comparing right-wing populism in, say, Italy or the United Kingdom with the United States, we need to recognize that actually the economic context for that is radically different. It's only in the US that you have seen this massive shift of economic and political resources to the top 1%. Now, why does that matter? Jacob and I suggest it matters because rising inequality or very high inequality is a triple threat to democracy. With inequalities in economic power come growing inequalities in political power. With growing inequality comes a growing gap between the preferences and interests of ordinary citizens and the preferences and interests of the very rich, right? So that healthcare bill and that tax cut bill, very much in the interests of the super wealthy, not in the interests of ordinary citizens, be they Democrats, Republicans, independents, whatever, right? And then finally, because of that divergence, you see in a context of high inequality that economic elites are likely to become increasingly fearful of democracy, right? If your preferences and interests are really different from that of ordinary citizens, then you become potentially a lot more worried about what ordinary citizens might do if they're given real access to political power. And so in thinking about how this plays out in politics, we lean pretty heavily, I will be the first to admit, because I'm a great admirer of his work, on Daniel Ziblatt's book, Conservative Parties and the Birth of Democracy. Now, some of you may know Ziblatt's work better through his joint work with Steve Levitsky on democratic backsliding, right? How democracies die. But before he wrote that book, co-wrote that book, he wrote this wonderful book on the role of conservative parties in the birth of democracy, and the cases he looks at most closely are the United Kingdom and Germany. And what he says is that conservative parties are tied to economic elites in quite unequal societies. And so as people are gaining the right to vote, this creates a dilemma for the conservative party, right? How do we hold on to our traditional allegiances and yet compete effectively in a space where ordinary citizens are increasingly getting the right to vote? And that's a basic dilemma that conservative parties face. And Ziblatt argues, and I think there's a lot of other social science research that confirms this, that how conservative parties deal with that dilemma has profound effects on the likelihood that democracy will be able to stabilize itself and institutionalize itself. Well, one thing you can do is to moderate on economic policy, right? You move, as say Bismarck did, right? You try to make moves in direction of the working class and the middle class, or as Disraeli famously did in the United Kingdom, where he talked about, finding the Tory voter that's hidden there that can be reached in part by moderating your economic appeals. But you're going to have a hard time outbidding the left on economic issues. So Ziblatt argues that conservative parties are invariably going to be driven to introduce what social scientists call a second dimension, a non-economic dimension to politics. They're going to push other kinds of cleavages in a society, whether that's around nationalism, anti-immigrant sentiments, racial cleavages, religious cleavages, and so on, right? And to be clear, the question is not whether they will do this. Ziblatt says they will do it, just given the likelihood that they will not be able to fully compete on economic issues. The question is whether they can do it in a way that they can manage. Can they successfully introduce and manage new lines of conflict into battles over political parties, over political power? And he says, if a conservative political party like the British Tories is well organized, it can potentially control that kind of process. They can domesticate it and not have it get out of control and lead to danger. But if the party is weak, if it's not that well organized, it finds itself having to rely on outside groups, what we call surrogates, right? To mobilize support around these kinds of issues. And this is exactly what happens in the United States over the last 30 years. This is the argument that we develop in the book. The Republican Party, which traditionally was a broad tent party, actually not that great at mobilizing outrage, as it became more and more intertwined with the rise of plutocracy in the United States, it simultaneously turned to outsourcing outrage to groups that could gin up this kind of second dimension identity politics. And the groups that we talk about in the book are the National Rifle Association, the Christian Right, and right-wing media, Fox News, talk radio, and so on, which is a different kind of organization, but it's played this really fundamental mobilizing role within the Republican Party. And I want to just mention quickly, I don't have time to go into this in more detail, but it's a central theme in the book. Racial resentment is central to the way that this mobilization works on the right in the United States. Much of these efforts to convince ordinary Americans, especially white working class and white middle class Americans, especially those who live further from urban areas, to vote for the Republican Party, is built around dog whistle appeals, or under President Trump, bullhorn appeals, which make people think about racial divisions, right? And so the US has gotten on this kind of escalation of white identity politics, but it's one in which plutocracy and this extreme form of populism feed and reinforce themselves, right? So far from populists ousting the conservative establishment, they've actually reinforced each other's worst impulses. So you get, as a former Republican speaker, Paul Ryan's chief of staff described it, he says, "We fed the beast that ate us." Or David Fromm, a prominent speechwriter under George W. Bush, said, "We used to think that Fox worked for us, and then we found that we worked for Fox." Right? So there's a Pandora box problem that Donald Trump has accelerated, but in many ways, he's a manifestation of it. Right? The feeding of this kind of outrage politics, very closely linked to the rise of plutocracy, has been central to what's been unfolding in the United States. And just a couple of quick slides to show how this has worked for the Conservative Alliance. Evangelicals, white evangelicals, are a declining share of the US population, part of the broader decline in the share of non-college educated whites in the United States population. But the white evangelical share of the national vote has been stable, actually growing a little bit since 2004, but mostly stable. And that reflects the increasingly intense efforts to mobilize Christian conservatives to make them feel like their way of life is threatened if they do not turn out for elections and vote Republicans. And similarly with gun owners, this question which asks over time, what's more important to you, protecting gun rights or controlling gun ownership? The views of Democrats have not changed much over time, but fed by the kind of rhetoric coming out of the National Rifle Association, Republican voters have moved much more in the direction of seeing gun regulation as a kind of existential threat, right, to their way of life, to their identity. So there's been this constant heating up of anger, resentment on the right, which provides a nice cover for plutocratic policies. Now, I want to just mention lastly that there's a very important part of the argument that we make, which is not just about the mobilization of resentment, but it's also about turning to rigging of elections, right? Or decreasing, so there are basically two things that you can do if you're facing this conservative dilemma. You can find other ways to mobilize voters, but if that is not enough, you can find ways to try to disenfranchise the voters on the other side, or make it so that you don't actually have to gain their votes in order to be in power. And we could talk more if we've got time about how that's worked in the US, but I just want to emphasize that a big role in the United States, you may wonder what you're looking at. I'll explain it in a second. A big role in the US for this is that American electoral rules give people representation based on the territory that they represent, not just the number of people who vote for them, right? And so what we're looking at is the path of a recent eclipse over the United States and what counties it crossed in its path across the United States. And you can see this is the 2016 election, whether these counties were carried by Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. And we know that Hillary Clinton actually won 3 million more votes than Donald Trump did, but you can see Donald Trump carried a lot more of the landmass. But in the United States, that's a huge advantage. That gives you a huge advantage in the Senate. It potentially gives you an advantage in the Electoral College. It's possible that we're going to face an election. There is no precedent for this in the United States. It's possible we're going to face an election in which Republicans will have lost a popular vote for the 7th time in the last 8 presidential elections. But we know but they could still win the presidency, as they have already done twice in the last 8 elections without winning the popular vote. So rigging is easier for the minority party in the United States because they're empowered in the Senate, they're empowered by the Electoral College, they're empowered by the Supreme Court. 6 of the 9 Supreme Court justices are likely very soon to be Republican appointed justices, not a single one of whom was nominated by a president who received a majority of the popular vote and confirmed by a Senate, by senators representing a majority of the country. It's really quite astonishing. So that's our account of what's happened in the United States. And I can't wait to hear commentary and questions about how we might think more broadly about this phenomenon, especially with respect to Brazil and Latin America.
Thank you, Paul. And now we're going to turn to Carlos Milani, who's a professor in the Institute for Social and Political Studies at Rio de Janeiro State University. He's also a senior research fellow with Brazil's National Research Council and associate editor of the Brazilian Political Science Review. I can't resist mentioning that he was a visiting scholar at the Center for Latin American Studies at Berkeley for a year. We all gained much from his insight, commentary, and writings while he was here. So Carlos, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Harley. And It's a pleasure to be here listening to Paul and sharing the screen, not the office or the room, with Liz for this quick debate for this webinar. I think that Hackers and Paul Pierson's book showcases how relevant it is to seriously understand through grounded social science research how such political practices prosper electorally and how they organize transnational networks that support their expansion in different world regions. If we think of far right-wing governments, authoritarian governments in North and South America, in Central and Eastern Europe, in India, and in the Philippines, we are going to realize that these authoritarian governments, in fact, they reflect in a way the influence, I think that's the first point, of social networks and their negative effects on democracy. Social networks without regulation, perhaps they also contribute to disrupting the role of political mediation that institutions have used to play in representative democracies. And I recall reading a book when I was at Berkeley in 2017, written by Cass Sunstein on #Republic. I think that was the title of the book, where he also analyzed the role that Facebook, the negative role that Facebook could play in terms of democracy building in the United States of America. And I think that this crisis of representative democracy also coincides with the reemergence of oligarchies, even in what we used to call in the past consolidated democracies. I recall a book also written by French political scientist Pierre-Rosan Vallon last January, where he uses a term, a category which I find pretty interesting. He calls it democrature. Right? It's a mixture between apparent democracy, because these leaders have been elected according to the electoral systems, but they don't play all the democratic games fully. And then he makes a mix of the two, creating this new term, which he calls democrature. Démocratie and dictature in French. In these practices and authoritarian governments, somehow demos is converted into populum, and the leaders attempt to govern in direct contact with their followers, and not anymore necessarily in dialogue with society, which is very diverse, of course, and the very differentiated social forces that exist in any given society, in Brazil, in the United States of America, in Hungary, or elsewhere. And I think that there is also another key factor. I'm being very schematic because for the sake of time, because I think there is a change in the sociology of labor that we should also take into consideration, and how post-industrial societies are organized. Here in Brazil, for example, one of the main, if not, I mean, the main center-left political party in Latin America, the Workers' Party, they have in the title the word the workers, but people who actually work as workers today in Brazil, they are so few that perhaps they don't even represent half of the electorate that traditionally votes for the Workers' Party here in Brazil. Of course, Paul has just mentioned it, growing inequalities in developed countries and the maintenance of a status quo of inequality in many developing countries. Of course, inequality in the US or in France or in many other developed countries today, they are shocking, but they are a reality. They are a point of departure of how societies have been built in Latin America and in Brazil in particular. And I think that because I come from the IR field, from international relations, I think there is systemically a persistent incapability and failure of decision makers in dealing with the root causes of the 2007 financial crisis. Unless, perhaps not really in Asia, where things have been dealt with in a different way, but systemically, I think this is a persistent problem also for our democracies. In the particular case of Brazil, I will just recall two authors who have recently published interesting books on how Bolsonaro came to power and how he maintains and how he has become a popular leader these days in Brazil with lots of support in the polls, irrespective of all the policies that he has destroyed in the last months. I refer to Adalberto Cardoso's book on Bolsonarismo and Jairo Nicolao's book on where he considers Bolsonaro as a popular leader today. And I think that this is important to understand. I mean, we can't demonize the citizens and the people who actually vote for Bolsonaro here in Brazil. We have to understand politically and sociologically this phenomenon, because Bolsonaro here in Brazil epitomizes many of Trump's political practices. Initially, he was very moved by an anti-workers' party diffused sentiment all over Brazilian society, but Bolsonaro has actually furthered a political movement wherein adversaries have been converted into enemies, but with lots of popular support. We are all aware of the trends of urban violence and rural violence here in Brazil. And I think that he gained support from many of these movements that were also very involved with urban and rural violence in the country. His faithful followers initiate and second denial campaigns here in Brazil. For example, on the actual existence of the dictatorship. Many of them, including Bolsonaro, have already said that the dictatorship was not really a dictatorship. Nihilism on climate change, of course, on the actual existence of deforestation, on COVID-19, and but also on racism and on racist practices in the country, on the importance of gender, and on gender policies here in the country. Gender is considered by far-right wing movements and supporters here in Brazil as an ideology and not as something that history and sociology have been able to analyze throughout years and decades of democratic construction. There is actually an interesting attempt to reframe human rights. It's not just to put into question the existence of a human rights regime per se, but to reframe the human rights narrative. For example, speaking of Christophobia. I mean, it's not only racism against the black, it's racism against the white. It's not only prejudice and discrimination against those who practice candomblé or Afro-Brazilian religions, but it's discrimination against neo-Pentecostal church supporters and followers. And then he even mentioned, I think in his last speech at the General Assembly of the United Nations this September, the word Christophobia, right? And of course, I think that there is another element that we should not neglect in Bolsonaro's practices here, which is an anti-regulation and pro-market set of policies, and which is also very much embedded in the way that his government has been, deconstructing 20, 30 years of efforts of democracy building after the military regime here in Brazil, and all the social policies that have been built since the beginning of redemocratization, since Cardoso going through Lula, Dilma, etc. I mean, all these policies, they are being deconstructed and with amazingly popular support. And I think that the mirror between what is going on in the United States currently and what is going on here is extremely important to understand, particularly at this point in history when you're going to have elections in America, in the United States of America. And I think that most of Brazilian Democrats and not belonging to the party, to the political party in the West, but the people who believe in democracy, we have never followed an American election with such an anxiety as this year, because we are, I mean, we truly believe that this election in the United States may have considerable effects in the way politics evolve and unfold here in Brazil, in South America. Thanks.
Thank you, Carlos. And now we'll turn to Liz Mckenna, who is a postdoctoral scholar at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. She received a PhD in sociology here at UC Berkeley. And while here, she made, I think, a really exceptional contribution to the Center for Latin American Studies, in part by writing for the Berkeley Review of Latin American Studies. She has several articles that are available on our website in the Berkeley Review. So let me turn it over to you, Liz.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Harley. Thank you, Janet and the class team for organizing this, and Paul and Carlos for your insights so far. So I'm going to jump right in because we have limited time. I know we want to get to Q&A. As Harley mentioned, I just finished my PhD in sociology at Berkeley, and I've spent the past 5 years or so studying political terrain shifts in Brazil. And based on that research, I want to bring 3 sort of arguments, or maybe we can call them provocations, about how the let them eat tweets thesis applies to Brazil or not. The first is to take a long view and think about the sort of long arc of history, longer than just the past 10 years. The second is to think in a way about inequality and democracy, their relationship, how it looks similar or different than in the United States. And then the third set of considerations I just wanted to surface was to sort of nuance the comparison and ask whether or not we can apply wholesale sort of the triple threat thesis that Paul outlined to Brazil. So one of the things I appreciate most about Paul and Jacob's approach is that, in both the book and actually in his remarks just now, I don't think he mentioned Trump. You may have said the word Trump once, but the book begins, this is not a book about Trump. And that's because there's an emphasis on durable policy configurations as opposed to the outrageousness of Trump or Bolsonaro gives him a run for his money on that mark, I think. So if we apply that perspective to Brazil about the durable configurations of power, we have to take a much longer view. So a whirlwind history, political history of Brazil, nearly 400 years of settler colonialism. Brazil was a slave economy. 40% of the 10 million enslaved Africans brought to the Americas ended up in Brazil, the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery. Finally, when independence was declared in 1822, there was a military coup that brought to power landed oligarchs, the plutocrats. They've been in power since the beginning. And importantly, in the old republic, actually, the positivist philosopher Augusto Comte, his motto, order and progress, was emblazoned on Brazil's flag, and that remains there today, and that will be important later. But what we have here, again, is rule based on the latifundios and the rule of the landed oligarchs. A bloodless coup brought Getúlio Vargas, a populist governor from the south, to power, followed by the Estado Novo, which was modeled after Italian fascism. Brazil had its first real experiment in kind of modern or close to modern democracy in the so-called populist republic from 1945 to 1985. It ended with the military, CIA, and business-backed coup in 1964, overthrowing João Goulart for a military dictatorship, the second longest in Latin America. That only ended in the late 80s, and now here we are in the period that scholars describe as the New Republic. So I share this very quick historical context to say that, was the shift from Lulismo to Bolsonarismo as stark as it may seem at first glance? Is this really a novel phenomenon? How much has inequality aided and abetted Brazil's plutocracy? But the real puzzle here is, how did some progressive governments prevail in a country that is predicated so deeply on racialized authoritarianism, if we take this long view? So that brings me to my next argument about, so Bolsonarismo and Trumpism, they're more historical rule than exception. And the second critical point, I think Carlos started to touch on this, about sort of understanding sociologically the Brazilian electorate and the Bolsonaro electorate. Brazil has long been much more right-wing than a great deal of existing scholarship acknowledges. So I'm going to just share one piece of evidence. I have more if there's time in the end, but this is just 3 questions from the F scale, the Adorno's Fascism Personality Survey administered nationwide in 2017, the year before Bolsonaro was elected. 81% of Brazilians agreed with the phrase that obedience and respect for authority are the most important virtues that children should learn. 69% said what this country needs more than laws and political programs are a few devoted leaders in whom people can put their faith. And 60%, so nearly 2/3 of the population agreed with the phrase, most of our social problems would be solved if we could somehow get rid of the immoral, crooked, and perverted people. And what was striking when I asked the researchers about this research, they said they found higher support for these statements among low-income Black and brown populations in Brazil. So that's sort of the long view contextualization. The second is about inequality and its relationship to support for democracy. What I'm showing you here is the x-axis is Gini coefficient, so it's a representation of inequality in a country. The y-axis is popular support for democracy. That's the percent of the population that agreed with the following phrase: democracy has its problems, but is the best form of government that we have. And so I've plotted all of the countries in Latin America here. The points are their country years, and what you see is a negative and statistically significant association between how unequal a country is and how much its populace supports democracy or not. So to the triple threat that Paul outlined, the third one is fear of democracy among elites, but we can add to that it's not just limited to economic elites, but rather the public at large. So the more unequal a country, the less, and if it's in name a democracy, what we see is that citizens more and more start to believe democracy in and of itself as a sort of delegitimated phenomenon. And in Brazil has long had the dubious distinction of being one of the most unequal countries in the world. This is a map that shows the top 10% of national income share. So Brazil's dark blue because almost 2/3 of income is concentrated in the hands of 10%. So it's even more, the wealth kind of gap that Paul showed for the US is actually even more extreme in the case of Brazil. One of the most staggering statistics that I've read is that Brazil's 6 richest individuals possess the same wealth as the bottom 100 million people. And this is in a country of a little over 200 million people. 6 people, 100 million. So here we are looking at like one of the most unequal countries in the world. Should it surprise us very much that we have that delegitimation of democracy? And then just to speak to Paul's point about the organized power and the way that the groups organize themselves, this is a simple graph comparing the percent of the population that each of these groups represent. So farmers represent less than about 1 or 2% of the population, but nearly half of all of Brazil's congressmen sit on the so-called cow caucus or the ruralist caucus, vastly overrepresented. Business owners, less than about 15% of the population, but 40% of congressional representatives. Evangelicals now represent about 1/3 and have even more than that in Congress. Contrast that with labor unions. About 15% of Brazilians belong to a labor union, but about 7% of congressional representatives belong to one as well. So this is a sort of provocation about, I think that this is quite similar. If we were to do the same analysis for the US, we would probably see something similar. That said, I do think there are some things that set the Brazil case apart, and Carlos has started to allude to some of these. So I mentioned the order and progress on Brazil's flag, and what we had in Bolsonaro was, early on in 2018, he picked Finance Minister Paulo Guedes, who is literally a Chicago boy. He was trained in economics and taught at Chicago, the University of Chicago, taught in Pinochet's Chile, and he said over and over during the campaign that Bolsonaro and Guedes were going to be the marriage of order Bolsonaro's authoritarianism and Guedes's progress. And so Carlos mentioned that policy after policy indeed have gone in favor. And pension reform is probably the most significant that passed. That was the sort of a #1 policy. But there are many, many more that we could talk about as well. But that said, I think it's important to outline here that, you know, when I was doing my interviews and fieldwork, especially when I was speaking with more progressive activists, they talked about the plutocrats as though they were a monolith. Actually, the phrase is grande capital, big capital. And so when I started to map this more systematically, what I found, I'm not going to go into this, but what this is a network map of right-wing actors in Brazil, or conservative actors, and how they're organized, colored by which capital fraction they belong to. So agribusiness, finance, industry, et cetera. And what I like to point out, or sort of bring to the table here, is that we have to think in a more nuanced way about how plutocrats have very real power struggles among themselves. In fact, I would say because the left is in such disarray that the most intense disputes right now are happening among fractions, for example, of agribusiness, about how they're widely supportive of Bolsonaro. They long have been, but there's a large and growing section of agribusiness that is quite worried that people are going to stop buying products from Brazil if Bolsonaro keeps torching the Amazon. And so they're genuinely worried about that. And that's a real power struggle that's happening among plutocrats in Brazil. And then the second piece is exactly what Carlos referred to, which is about low-income voters in peripheral geographies. And I apologize that I didn't invert the color scheme here. Red in Latin America is left-wing. It's not Republican, GOP, but what you're looking at here is the metro region of Rio from 2002 to 2018. So the red that you're seeing is support for the PT. It's votes for Lula in 2002, Lula in 2006, his successor Dilma in 2010. Again, she won in 2014, but in 2018, that completely flipped. And so anyone who knows sort of Rio geography might be surprised by this, because these are truly peripheral regions, low-income favelas that voted en masse for Bolsonaro. The PT didn't win a single electoral zone in Brazil. I think they may have had one precinct in Zona Sul, which was one of a wealthier precinct that Haddad won by 2 points. So that's critical to nuance. It's also important to remember what E.E. Schnattensteiner said about 80 years ago, is that new policies create new politics. And that's what we've had in the past several months with Bolsonaro's policy around the Corona voucher, 600 reais a month going to people, low-income people who previously received the conditional cash transfer, whereas they had 100 reais a month in that program, they now have 600 reais a month. Predictably, Bolsonaro's support has increased among those recipients of Bolsa Familia. I have a whole thing about how we shouldn't think about that as crass economics, but it really is something to pay attention to in terms of the widening support for Bolsonaro in these former strongholds of the PT. There are a couple more things that I hope we can talk about, and maybe it'll have to be offline, but because Paul mentioned them, it's about the Christian right and the evangelicals. That phenomenon looks different in Brazil as well. They supported Lula actually throughout the election until the very last minute. So if you look at polls among evangelicals, until Lula was taken off the ballot, they were actually, the vast majority of evangelicals in Brazil were going to support him. They had before for the past 15 years. And then the institutional rules that Paul mentioned. So in Brazil, it's one vote, one person. There's not the same sort of territorial mismatch. Bolsonaro won by 10 million votes, and Trump lost by 3 million. So I think that's sort of a critical piece to bring up as well. And I'll stop there and look forward to speaking to everyone in Q&A.
Thank you, Liz, for putting a lot of issues on the table and some really fascinating comparisons. The original plan was to have a brief discussion among Paul, Liz, and Carlos, but I think what we'll do, because of time, is perhaps go to the questions, unless either Carlos or Liz has a question for Paul real quickly, and the same Paul for Carlos or Liz. So let me start with Carlos and Liz. Are there any quick questions that you might want to put out?
I'd be happy to open it up right up. I know we're short on time. Okay.
Carlos, comments or questions?
I think we can go for a Q&A immediately. Yeah, there's no problem.
Okay, great. Then let me begin with Jeremy from Oakland. what modes of actions can be taken to combat the new authoritarianism? Paul, would you start?
Well, so, I mean, first of all, I just want to thank both Carlos and Liz for those amazing presentations. And I wish we had more than 9 minutes because there's so many interesting issues to get on the table. And I'll say sort of one general thing in reaction, which would be also what would lead my answer to the question. There are obviously, I think as Liz was really pointing out, there are some important similarities or commonalities between these cases. There are also some pretty striking differences, which I think you did an amazing job of bringing out in a short period of time. And so, you know, I think I would caution immediately against trying to say there is a new authoritarianism and the way that one responds to it is X. I wouldn't begin even after the brief education I just got, to try to make suggestions about how that might work in Brazil. I will say in the American case, so I guess one thing, so I'll only talk about the American case and only very briefly, which would be to say, and this seems like a pretty striking difference between the situation in Brazil. Donald Trump is not popular. Right? Donald Trump is not popular. He's actually historically unpopular for a president, just in terms of his overall approval rating throughout his term, right? So and he has not expanded his base of support over his time in office. It sounds like that is quite different from the situation in Brazil, and it'd be interesting to think about what that means. But for this particular question, it means I think in the US, as Carlos was suggesting, we are sort of on a knife's edge where the election and the transfer of power associated with that election, and we have to think of those as distinct phenomena now, right? Which is a new thing in the United States. It's not just a question of who gets how many votes, but what happens after that and how the courts deal with it and so on. You know, I still think in the US, the first line of combat and vital at this point is to try to win in that electoral conflict.
The next question I'd like to ask Carlos and Liz to comment on first, and then you. And it's about the presidential debate 2 days ago, which had a worldwide audience. What is your reaction to the reception and the impact of that debate?
Liz, would you like to go first? Okay, thank you. Thanks, Harley. Well, let me just make a small comment on the previous question that was brought forward. I think that to fight against new or old or any kind of authoritarianism, I think it is important first to understand what it is and to understand in different contexts how it unfolds. And I think it is important as a social scientist also to go beyond the walls of my university, of my, well, I'm not in my office anymore, I'm at home, right? But anyway, talk to people. I think it's important to understand and to study, to analyze, and also to talk to people and to try to deconstruct some of these post-truths that have been circulating, I mean, or fake news, but with the argument of authority, because they are seconded and supported, in our case, by the president, by many ministers, by many leading politicians in Brazil. And then I think it is important to deconstruct with argument, with statistics, with data, and with history, that perhaps the situation is not as white and black as it is portrayed by many of these leaders. I think this is extremely, perhaps it's very modest as a fight, but I think that if we want to fight against violence too, I think we have to use arguments and intellectual arguments, because otherwise perhaps you're going to end up using the same tools that they are actually using, at least here in Brazil. And I think that I think it's important to understand that well, here in Brazil, people who follow American politics, they are very few. We are very few, right? And even if this debate between Biden and Trump was extremely important, of course, I followed it. Very few Brazilians have followed it on TV. Including because it's not shown in all kinds of screens, right? You have to have some access in order to have in order to be able to follow that debate. But I think it was very important to see that Amazonia was there, and that deforestation and the concern for deforestation was there. And I think that currently Bolsonaro's government is very worried as to what may happen in case Biden wins the election, particularly because of his current policies of literally destruction of the forest, but not only the tropical forest, but also the Pantanal, another extremely important ecosystem, and the Cerrado, which is our savanna, which is also very threatened. And I think that this issue, this environmental issue, which was there very quickly on the debate, that really called the attention of those Brazilians who were following the debate.
So I'll respond just very quickly. I think the question about the debate, well, I will admit that I did a Google Scholar search before the debate and asked, to see whether or not debates actually matter. Like, do they actually change opinions? And so then I found out that most of the scholarship says that they don't. So I gave myself permission to turn it off early. But I think it's really important and it links back to Let Them Eat tweets, because there's kind of like the foam around politics, like in Portuguese, the espuma, like there's the sideshow, there's Trump on Twitter, there's what he's doing, he's being a fourth grade bully, and then there's the real underlying organized politics beneath that. And so I think the more that we can, and this links to the first question about what we can actually do about this, if you'll indulge me for 1 second, this is one of the themes of my dissertation, was looking at sort of what we can do. And what I analyzed here is that, the left in Brazil kept repeating the same strategy of mobilization. They said, we must insist on the streets. Let's go to the streets. We're going to protest Bolsonaro over and over and over again. And the right organized and articulated those network maps that I was showing you over and over and over again. And so, the more that we can keep a clear-eyed focus on how power is organized and less on what Donald Trump, tweeted last night or what he said in the debate, I think the better position the left will be in to hopefully shift those configurations going forward.
Great, thank you. Paul, do you have a
Yeah, so I'm so sad that we're running out of time because there's so much to say, and I'm just noting there are some nice questions in the Q&A as well. Maybe there's a way to, feel free to email me if people want to keep talking about this stuff. I'll just say 2 things about the rather shocking debate that I'm happy for their sakes that most Brazilians missed, because it was really extraordinarily awful. But 2 things that I would say about it. One is the fact that the president would not call out and actually did the opposite of calling out white supremacists, essentially right-wing militias, is an astonishing development. And it speaks to the issue that Liz raised about thinking about the longue durée, about thinking about the deep history of inequalities, where I think that she's completely right to emphasize that. And of course, in the US, that would mean, an ancient history of structural racism as being fundamental to this. Though I do think it sounds like more in the US than in Brazil, things have changed. The balance of power has changed pretty radically from greater inequality to much less inequality in the last 30 or 40 years. That seems like an important difference. The 1% share in the US looked a lot like, say, Germany, 40 years ago. It doesn't now. So there has been a real shift that maybe makes it somewhat different, I think, than Brazil, despite the long histories of inequalities in both countries. And then the other thing I would say about Trump's behavior in the debate was, it's part of a broader effort to delegitimate elections, right? And to delegitimate voting, which is quite astonishing and enormously dangerous. It reflects the fact that he has not been able to consolidate electoral support, again, different from Bolsonaro, and that that the factions that he represents do see democracy as an enemy in which the clock is not on their side. And so it is, of course, extremely dangerous, but also telling that given this kind of forum, the president essentially used it to further alienate ordinary citizens from American democracy, and to spread, completely non-fact-based ideas about fraud in American elections.
Thank you. We're going to go a little long. We won't be able to get to all the questions that came in, but some of the remaining questions really hit on what we've already been discussing in a perceived way. Before going to that, I have a brief comment on the debate last night. In the United States, it was widely criticized for the president's boorish behavior, bullying, and otherwise being disruptive. But in the New York Times analytical piece about the debate immediately after, the authors used a fascinating term that Trump hijacked the debate. In other words, this wasn't a food fight between two opponents. This was an attempt to hijack the debate in an unprecedented way and to seize control of the agenda. To what extent this works, we will see. It is also fascinating. We know this is watched worldwide, but not necessarily by popular bases worldwide. And Carlos, you saying that, I think, also added a valuable dimension to the response from the debate outside the US. One of the questions that came in from Janet is for Liz and builds on this dimension of populism. Encouraging racial anxiety and identity politics in middle to low income sectors is a strategy used by the US right to elect governments that benefit plutocrats instead of the economic interests of their base. Is this a strategy used in Brazil also? What's the role of, and a second part of this, what's the role of perceptions of corruption in helping elect these right-wing politicians in Brazil?
Thank you. That's a great question. I'll try to be as brief as possible. You'll notice that corruption it dominated the headlines from about 2013 until 2019, Bolsonaro's first year in office. And now it's completely disappeared. And that's because Bolsonaro and his entire family are ensnared in corruption scandal after corruption scandal. And Moro, the famous sort of heralded Superman who was going to fix corruption in Brazil, had a falling out with Bolsonaro. So I view that more, the way I've viewed and analyzed sort of the Lava Jato and all of the fallout around it is much more as sort of a political cudgel that is reflective of who's actually in power. So whoever's wielding the cudgel of corruption is likely the one that has, the upper hand in terms of the power terrain. It's why Dilma was ousted on, phony pretexts, and then it's also why Lula was jailed and held under a gag order, even though that hasn't happened for, common criminals are not held under a gag order. So the corruption piece is really interesting, worthy of a longer discussion, as is the racial resentment. And so, as I mentioned, Bolsonaro has it's a surprisingly wide support among, low income. He had on the night of the election, he had the lowest level of support among Afro-Brazilians. But however, or rather followers of Candomblé and Umbanda, the religions that Carlos mentioned. But we can't map it on exactly in the way that Paul sort of, helped us think about the white supremacy as the base motivator for Trump. That said, there's a lot of research that demonstrates sort of what's, like an elite white backlash to the PT years. Over and over and over again, you'll hear things like women, wealthy people saying, oh, the airport has become a bus station because my maid can now travel. So economic advancement throughout the 2000s rather, led to the changing of spaces. Universities democratized. There are more Black and brown people in these spaces that were otherwise elite spaces. And so to the extent that there is racialized resentment and backlash, I would point to sort of that literature that has analyzed what happened during the PT years.
Thank you. And I'd like to point out some of the questions we have. We will try to make available to the participants and continue the discussion, if only briefly, online through CLAS. So we ask you to check the CLAS website at clas.berkeley.edu, and we will seek to continue part of this discussion. And one of the things that we've commented on right at the beginning that all three speakers mentioned is the similarities in structure in terms of high inequality, populist leaders, and some of the other themes that were discussed. We also put these issues in a historical context for both countries. But the reality that we know today that has never been more apparent is what happens in Brazil truly impacts the rest of the world. If the Amazon is burned, it is not simply Brazilians that suffer. And what we've known is that what happens in the US on many issues, but critically on climate change, impacts the entire world. To the extent Trump denies the human origins of climate change or the climate crisis, is to an extent the entire world feels the pain. We are also confronting some new reality, which is that damage that occurs in one administration, whether in Brazil or in the United States, may not be reversible for decades, if at all, in future administrations that address these issues. So with that, I'd like to thank again our participants for superb presentations, our participants in the conversation, and also those who were participants in this webinar for being with us today. We look forward to seeing you at future CLAS webinars. Thank you.